If this story hits close to home, hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. She packed lingerie I'd never seen before, folded it neatly into her suitcase like it was the most natural thing in the world, and I stood in the doorway watching her, already knowing exactly what it meant. My name is Daniel Hargrove. I'm 49 years old, and for 16 years I was married to a woman named Melissa. Most of those years I gave her everything I had: patience, loyalty, a home she helped design from the studs up, and the kind of quiet support that doesn't make headlines but holds a life together. What I didn't realize until much too late was that Melissa had stopped seeing any of it. She'd been building a different future, and I wasn't in it. The retreat was at the end of April, 4 days at a mountain resort in the Rockies, the kind of place that exists to remind people how much money they don't have. Melissa had mentioned it weeks earlier with the casual efficiency of someone announcing a dentist appointment. Work thing, leadership team only. You'd be bored, Daniel. I nodded. I said, of course, have a great time. What I didn't say was that I'd been watching her for 3 months, counting the inconsistencies the way a contractor counts structural cracks. Not with panic, but with the cold arithmetic of someone who needs to understand what they're dealing with before they decide what to do. Tuesday night before she left, she packed while I pretended to read. The clothes she chose were not work clothes. I know the difference. I've been folding laundry in this house for over a decade. I know every piece she owns. These weren't pieces I recognized. She moved through the process with a precision that looked rehearsed, the way people move when they've imagined doing something many times before actually doing it. New wardrobe? I asked. She didn't look up. Presentation matters at these things. First impressions with the executive team. She was right about that. First impressions do matter. She'd made quite an impression on her CEO, a man named Warren Stiles, silver-templed, late 50s, the kind of executive who wore his authority like a second skin and had long since stopped distinguishing between professional admiration and personal entitlement. I'd met him twice, once at a company function, once at a holiday dinner. Both times he'd found reasons to be physically close to Melissa. A guiding hand at the small of her back, laughter that started a half-second too fast, the practiced attentiveness of a man who believed access was a reward he'd earned. Wednesday morning, she kissed my cheek at the door. The kiss was automatic, the kind people give when the habit is still intact but the meaning has gone. "Don't wait up," she said, already moving toward her car. I didn't wait up. What I did instead was walk to my study, open the bottom drawer of my desk, and take out a leather portfolio I'd been building for 6 months. Ever since the night I came home early from a client meeting to find Melissa on the back porch, speaking into her phone in that low, careful voice people use when they believe they're alone. "He has no idea," she'd said, and then, soft enough that I almost missed it. "That's what makes it exciting." She was right. I hadn't known. Not yet, but what she'd misjudged, critically as it turned out, was the difference between a man who doesn't know and a man who has simply decided not to show his hand. The portfolio contained documents that had been 6 months in the making: acquisition records, shareholder registrations, legal correspondence from my attorney, a sharp woman named Constance Webb, who specialized in corporate law and had not blinked once during any of our conversations, even the ones where I'd laid out the full scope of what I intended. Because here's what Melissa didn't know about the company she'd been climbing inside for 8 years. I owned 64% of it now. I'd acquired the stake quietly through a series of blind trusts and intermediary entities, purchasing shares from investors who were quietly losing confidence in Warren Stiles' leadership, and there were more of those than anyone admitted publicly. I'd been methodical, patient. I'd attended exactly none of the gatherings where this might have come up, maintained exactly the right distance from the company to avoid drawing attention. My name appeared nowhere obvious. That was by design. The Monday morning shareholders meeting was already on the calendar. Melissa had a 4-day head start on the mountain. I had a board meeting to prepare for. I should tell you what the warning signs had actually looked like, because people always ask that afterward. They want a list, a checklist, something that would have made it obvious earlier. But betrayal doesn't announce itself with a list. It's more like temperature change. gradual, easy to dismiss. The first thing I noticed was the silence, not absence. Melissa was home plenty, but a kind of conversational withdrawal. We used to debrief our days over dinner the way other couples might watch television, fully, with commentary. She was perceptive about people, about office dynamics, about the small social mechanisms that determined who thrived and who stalled. I loved listening to her think out loud. It was one of the things that had made me fall for her in the first place. Then, around 8 months ago, the commentary stopped. Our dinners became pleasant and empty. She'd mention work the way you mention weather, briefly, without investment. When I asked questions, I got answers that technically contained information but communicated nothing. Strategy sessions, stakeholder alignment, transformation roadmaps, language designed to sound substantial while disclosing precisely zero. The shift had coincided almost exactly with Warren Stiles' appointment as CEO. New perfume appeared, expensive and unfamiliar. Restaurant charges showed up on the credit card for places we'd never been together. Her phone, once left carelessly on countertops and windowsills, became a protected object, face down, password changed, always within arm's reach. When I mentioned it, she had an answer ready. Data security protocols, company-wide policy update, all executives required to comply. Plausible, technically possible, completely false. The confirmation came on a Thursday in February. I'd wrapped a consulting project early and driven home to find her car in the garage, but the house carrying that particular quiet. That means no one expected you. I climbed the stairs toward our bedroom and heard her voice through the door, low, careful, controlled, the register of someone who thinks they're speaking in a sealed room. "He's not back until 7, she was saying. "We have time." And then a soft laugh. "I know it's complicated. That's part of why it works." I stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then I walked back downstairs, sat in my study, and began what I should probably call preparation rather than planning. Because I wasn't planning to hurt her. I was preparing to protect myself, to understand what I was actually dealing with, and to make sure that when the moment came, I was the one who chose it. I contacted Constance Webb the following week. She came recommended by an old colleague who described her as someone who thinks 3 moves ahead and never gets emotional about any of them. That assessment turned out to be accurate. At our first meeting, I walked her through what I knew and what I suspected. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked 2 questions. The first was about the company. The second was about the prenuptial agreement. Both answers were useful. The prenuptial agreement had been signed 11 years ago. At Melissa's suggestion, ironically, she'd been the one who raised it, saying she wanted to protect both of our interests and enter the marriage with clarity. I'd signed it without much analysis at the time, mostly because it seemed like a reasonable thing to do. What I hadn't fully appreciated until Constance walked me through it was how comprehensively it protected assets held in trust or acquired through inheritance. The property I'd inherited from my father, a house and several parcels of land, existed entirely outside the marital estate. Mi pareja did a considerable portion of my investment holdings, which had been restructured 18 months earlier when I'd consulted a financial planner about tax efficiency. Melissa had signed off on those restructuring documents without reading them closely. She'd been busy. She'd trusted me to handle the paperwork, which I had, correctly, thoroughly, and in my own interest. Constance had looked at the documents for a long time. Then she'd looked at me. "You've been preparing for a while," she said. "Not planning, preparing. There's a difference." She'd allowed herself the smallest possible smile. "Fair enough. Let's talk about the company." Now there was one more piece I needed before the board meeting, and it had nothing to do with shares or legal filings. 3 years earlier, Melissa had introduced me to her closest friend, a woman named Joanna Pruitt, who'd been Melissa's college roommate and who I'd always genuinely liked. Joanna was direct in a way that had become unusual, funny without trying, the kind of person who says the actual thing instead of the socially safe version of it. She'd told me once, early in our acquaintance, that I was too decent for my own good and that I should watch myself around people who mistake decency for weakness. I hadn't understood what she meant at the time. 2 months after the hallway conversation, I reached out to Joanna, not at our usual spots, somewhere quiet and across town where neither of us would be recognized. She'd arrived already tense, already guessing. Before I could get through my second sentence, she'd set down her coffee and looked at me with the expression of someone preparing to say something they'd been carrying too long. "Nathan, I've been trying to figure out how to call you for 4 months." She knew, had known since before I did, had watched it happen and had argued with Melissa about it, had told her exactly what she was risking, had been shut out of the conversation once it became clear she wasn't going to endorse what was happening. She didn't cry when she told me, but her voice went to a register I hadn't heard from her before, tight and exhausted and angry in a way that had nowhere to go. "I'm not angry with you," I told her, "but I need your help with something that might be uncomfortable." She'd listened, then she'd said, "What do you need?" Here's what I hadn't told anyone except Constance. 6 weeks before the retreat, Melissa had accused me, during an argument about my emotional availability, of being mi pareja, disconnected from the marriage that I probably wouldn't notice if someone else showed interest in me. She'd said it as a grievance. I'd heard it as a dare. Mi pareja, I'd taken her up on it. The plan was simple. Joanna would come by the house on a weeknight, ostensibly to return a book, dressed nicely, relaxed, slightly flirtatious. We would have a conversation in the living room. What Joanna didn't know was that I'd installed a full home security system 2 weeks earlier, cameras covering every common area, recording continuously to encrypted cloud storage. Melissa thought the cameras were for burglary deterrence. She didn't know they ran around the clock. Joanna played her part well. She touched my arm when she laughed. She leaned in a few degrees closer than necessary. She made a remark that could have meant two different things depending on how you were listening. And then, after about 40 minutes, she tilted slightly forward, the kind of movement that communicates intent before contact. I stepped back. "Joanna," I said, making sure my voice was clear and audible. "I can't. I made a commitment to my marriage and I intend to keep it, even now." She stepped back as well, and something in her face moved from performance into something genuine. She looked at me for a moment and said, quietly, "She doesn't deserve what she has." "Maybe not," I replied. "But that's not why I'm faithful. It's just who I am." The recording was exactly what I needed it to be. Constance watched it during our next meeting and described it as establishing clean hands in terms that were measurable, documented, and beyond challenge. More than that, it was a record I needed for myself, proof that I hadn't become the thing I was fighting against, that I'd stayed on the right side of a line that mattered to me regardless of whether anyone else was watching, which, now, someone was. Melissa arrived at the Ridgecrest Mountain Resort on a Thursday afternoon in April, stepping out of the hired car with the composure of someone who expects the world to arrange itself around her preferences. The air was cold and clean, the peaks behind the main lodge still carrying snow from a late storm. She registered at the front desk and was directed to the executive floor, a corridor of premium suites whose windows overlooked a valley that made everything else feel small. The suite was already prepared. Rose petals on the duvet, arranged in a pattern she couldn't quite read from the doorway. A bottle of wine on the sideboard, uncorked and breathing. A wooden box on the coffee table. Dark walnut, heavy, with a brass plate engraved on the lid. She picked it up and read the inscription, "To the wife of the new majority shareholder." She laughed, a single, confused sound. Some kind of error, obviously, a room service mix-up, or a message meant for someone else. She opened the box. Inside was a single card, cream stock, handwritten in the careful script she had been looking at for 16 years. Her husband's handwriting. "Enjoy the view, Daniel." The laughter stopped. She turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The mountain range stretched out beyond the glass in every direction. Immense, cold, indifferent, she stood there without breathing until the television mounted on the opposite wall activated automatically, triggered by the room key she'd set on the bedside table. "Welcome, Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove." Executive penthouse suite. She stared at it, waited for it to correct itself. It didn't. Her hands were unsteady when she dialed the front desk. Front desk, how can I assist you, Mrs. Hargrove? There's a mistake with this room. The name is wrong. The reservation, there's no mistake, ma'am. The reservation was confirmed personally by Mr. Hargrove 3 weeks ago. He was very specific about the arrangements. He asked that everything be perfect for your arrival. Which Mr. Hargrove? She said. Daniel Hargrove, ma'am. She ended the call. The room felt smaller now, the luxury pressing in from all sides. She moved to the closet and found her luggage already unpacked, her clothes hanging in precise order, as if by a person who knew exactly how she organized her things, because he had been watching her do it for 16 years. And there, on the shelf above the hanging rail, something that shouldn't have been there at all, a framed photograph from their 10th anniversary dinner. Her hand on his arm, both of them laughing at something off camera, back when laughing together had still been uncomplicated. She had taken this photo off her office wall 7 months ago. She hadn't thrown it away. She'd just moved it somewhere she didn't have to look at it. Now it was looking at her. A knock at the door. She opened it. Warren Stiles stood in the hall with a bottle of champagne and the smile he wore when he believed he'd already won. Behind him, a bellhop waited with a brass cart. Warren stepped forward and stopped when he saw her face, then looked past her into the room. The rose petals, the wine, the television glowing with a name that wasn't his. What is this? His voice had changed register. The bellhop cleared his throat with the practiced neutrality of someone paid to deliver information regardless of how it lands. Shall I move the rest of Mrs. Hargrove's belongings from the second cart, sir? Mr. Hargrove asked that all her things be kept together in the penthouse. Warren's head turned slowly. What penthouse? The executive penthouse, sir. Mr. Hargrove reserved it directly. He's the majority shareholder, holds 64% of the company as of last Monday. The bellhop's expression remained professionally neutral. I assumed you'd been informed. The champagne bottle in Warren's grip suddenly looked like it weighed considerably more than it had a moment ago. What happened next changed everything, but it happened on a Monday morning, in a boardroom on the 15th floor, not on a mountain. I arrived at Brightfield Technologies 30 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. The boardroom was all glass and polished steel, the aesthetic of a company that wanted to look innovative without committing to anything that couldn't be reversed. 5 of the 7 directors were already present when I walked in. Elliot Marcus, the CFO, stood immediately and extended his hand. Daniel, good to finally do this properly. Elliot, I said. I appreciate everyone making time. We went through the roadmaps I'd sent last week, he said. 3 of us were up past midnight. The others arrived over the next 10 minutes. Sandra Cho from Legal, Robert Fenwick, a founding director who'd been with the company longer than anyone else at the table, Patricia Haas from the venture capital group that had led the Series B, Miles Okafor, the independent director who sat on 3 other boards and was known for asking the questions no one else wanted to ask, and finally, Warren Stiles, dressed with the precision of someone who'd gotten up early to make sure he looked in control. He took his seat at the head of the table. His eyes moved across the room with the efficiency of a man reading a situation, and I watched him understand, in the space of about 4 seconds, that the room had already shifted. He just didn't know yet in which direction. Let's proceed, Warren said. I understand, Mr. Hargrove has called this session, though I'd have appreciated more advance notice. Majority shareholders get to set the agenda, Robert Fenwick said, not unkindly. That's what the bylaws say, Warren. Warren's hand settled on the arm of his chair. His expression didn't change, but the knuckles went slightly pale. I stood. I'd prepared a clean, factual presentation. No theatrics, no unnecessary emotion. This was a business meeting, and I intended to run it like one. As of the close of business last Friday, through a series of properly registered transactions reviewed by the appropriate oversight bodies, I now hold 64% of Brightfield's voting shares. I want to walk the board through how we arrived here and what I propose happens next. I walked them through it. The timeline of acquisitions, the shell entities through which shares had been accumulated, the investors who'd sold quietly because they'd lost confidence in the current leadership direction. I showed the financial trends, 8 consecutive quarters of declining innovation metrics, rising operating costs, and 3 separate HR complaints that had been processed internally and then buried. I did not need to say Warren's name in connection with those complaints. The documents said it for me. Sandra Cho leaned forward. Daniel, what are you proposing? I'm not here to liquidate or dismantle anything. I'm here to stabilize. The company has good people in it. People who've been watching the culture drift for 2 years and haven't had a mechanism to say me pareja. I intend to give them one. And the current CEO, Patricia Haas, said. I turned to face Warren directly. Your employment agreement contains a conduct clause. I have documentation sufficient to trigger it. I distributed folders, one for each board member, none for Warren. Inside, printed communications, hotel expense records filed against the company account, a clear pattern of inappropriate relationships with subordinates that had been actively concealed. Melissa's name appeared throughout, but my pareja did 2 other women who had each left the company in the prior 18 months under circumstances that, viewed individually, seemed unremarkable and, viewed together, told a different story entirely. This is a targeted campaign, Warren said. His voice had the flatness of a man who's decided to play defense. This is documentation, Robert Fenwick replied, without looking up from the folder. There's a difference. I gave everything I had for this company, Warren said, looking at me now. I know the feeling, I replied. The vote took 12 minutes. 5 in favor of removing Warren as CEO. 1 abstention, 1 director who said he needed additional time to review and would submit his position within 24 hours. Warren himself had no vote on his own termination. That's a standard clause in contracts written by people who've thought about how these situations tend to go. He stood, straightened his jacket. This isn't finished. It is, I said. Security will walk you out. Your access codes have already been deactivated. After he left, the room exhaled collectively. Patricia Haas spoke first. What about Melissa? Her office was on the 12th floor, corner suite, windows on 2 sides. She'd negotiated those windows as part of her last promotion package. They had been, she told me at the dinner we'd had to celebrate, the symbol of everything she'd been working toward. The proof that she'd made it. I wanted to be there when she heard. Not out of cruelty. I've thought about that enough to be honest about it. But because some conversations require physical presence to be real. Constance came with me. We took the elevator to 12. Melissa was at her desk when we came through the door, typing with the focused intensity of someone who had something to prove or something to outrun. She looked up, saw me, saw Constance. Something moved across her face in quick succession. Confusion, then recognition, then the first edge of fear. Daniel, what are you doing here? We need to talk, I said. I pulled a chair away from the wall and sat across from her desk, the way you'd sit with someone you're about to have a difficult but necessary conversation with. Constance stood. If this is about the retreat, it's not about the retreat. I heard her hear something in my tone that stopped the next sentence before it started. I'm here in my capacity as the majority shareholder of this company. Constance is here as legal counsel. As of this morning, the board has voted to remove Warren Stiles as CEO, effective immediately, and you're being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into violations of the company's conflict of interest disclosure policy. The color left her face by degrees, like watching a tide go out. Investigation. Her voice had gone to a register I didn't recognize. For what? For an undisclosed personal relationship with a senior executive, Constance said. You signed the disclosure policy 3 years ago. The relationship was not reported. That's a material breach. Melissa looked at me for a long time. When she spoke again, the professional armor was gone. Just her voice, just the real version of it, the one I hadn't heard in over a year. Nathan, please, let me explain. I've been patient, I said. I've been patient for 8 months. I know about the hotel stays. I know about the dinners. I know you went to that resort to be with him. And I know that when you told me I wasn't invited, you weren't just telling me about a work trip. You were telling me something about what you thought of me. How long have you known? She whispered. Long enough to do something about it. I took an envelope from inside my jacket and set it on her desk. Divorce papers, filed on grounds of adultery. The documentation is complete. She opened the envelope with hands that weren't steady, turned through the first several pages. Her face moved through expressions I'd seen before, in different contexts. Surprise, then disbelief, then something harder to name. You're taking everything. I'm taking what's mine, I said. The house is held in a trust that predates our marriage. Your equity position in this company carries conduct clauses, which you've violated. The retirement vehicles were restructured 2 years ago. You were at a conference that week. You signed the documents electronically, which the records confirm took approximately 40 seconds. Constance placed a card on the desk beside the envelope. You'll retain your personal savings and your vehicle. The prenuptial agreement you signed establishes the terms clearly. You have 3 days to obtain counsel and respond. Generous, Melissa said. Her voice carried the particular bitterness of someone who knows they have no leverage but hasn't finished processing that fact. You're ending my career and taking our home, and you call that generous? I'm enforcing consequences, I said, standing. You made choices, Melissa. I didn't make them for you. Warren will fight this. He has attorneys. Warren was removed from the building 90 minutes ago. He's not in a position to fight anything. I moved toward the door, then paused with my hand on the frame. I would have given you everything, I said, willingly, without a contract, without documentation, without any of this. All it would have taken was honesty. You chose something else. Remember that everything in the description and the pinned comment, from fitness to wellness to everything in between, is there for you anytime you need it. I left her there. In the elevator, Constance said, You kept your composure. I had to, I said. She needed to see that I wasn't destroyed by it, that I was still standing. The doors opened to the lobby and I walked out into April sunlight, feeling, for the first time in 8 months, like I could breathe all the way down. 4 days after the board meeting, a padded envelope arrived at my office. No return address. My name printed on a plain label in a font I didn't recognize. Inside was a medical document, photocopied pages from a private clinic file, paper clipped to a handwritten note in a hand I recognized immediately. You needed to know the whole truth. J.P. Joanna Pruitt. I sat with the envelope in my hands for a moment before I opened it, sensing, the way you sometimes sense things without being able to explain why, that what was inside was going to cost me something even after everything else had already been paid. But I had made a commitment to myself, in those early months of preparation, that I would not look away from the real shape of things. Mi pareja, I read it. The document was a surgical consent form for a sterilization procedure. The clinic was in Portland. The date was 11 years ago. The patient name was Melissa Ann Calloway, her maiden name, before we married. I sat back in my chair. 11 years ago. She'd been 34. We'd married a year later when she was 35. Throughout our marriage, throughout years of conversations about children, years of waiting and hoping, and Melissa looking across the table at me with an expression of shared disappointment every month when nothing happened, she had known, had always known. I thought about the conversations, the deliberate ones where she'd hold my hand and say, maybe next month, maybe we just need to be patient, maybe when the job stabilizes. I thought about how specific the performance had been, how sustained, How she had watched me grieve something that was never going to happen and had said nothing, had chosen nothing, had simply maintained the lie because the alternative, telling me the truth, might have cost her the marriage she wanted. My phone rang. "Joanna, did you get it?" "I got it." "How long have you known?" She told me the year. She'd found out from Melissa directly, years ago, when they were still the kind of close where the real things got said. Melissa had told her that children didn't fit the trajectory she'd mapped out for herself, that she couldn't compete at the level she intended while managing the physical and professional costs of pregnancy. When I'd asked Joanna recently whether Melissa had ever planned to tell me, Joanna had been quiet for a moment before answering. "She said you'd eventually accept it, that you were too accommodating to leave over something like that." The words landed in a specific way. "I let them." "She was wrong about that," I said. "I know," Joanna replied. "That's why I sent you the file." I sat in my study for a long time after the call. The city was visible through the window, gray and familiar, moving at its own pace, indifferent to the interior weather of one man in one room. I thought about the version of myself that had existed 5 years ago, and how much trust that person had carried without questioning it, and how little it had cost Melissa to spend it. The medical file went into the legal folder. Constance received it the same evening. "Nathan, this is significant," she said when she'd had time to review it. "In some jurisdictions, concealment of this kind before a marriage constitutes fraudulent inducement. It strengthens every element of what we've already filed." "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Fine," I said, and I meant it. Every truth that surfaces makes the ground feel more solid, not less. I know what I'm standing on now. "That's healthy," she said. "Most people in your position go looking for ways to make it stop hurting. You went looking for the whole picture." "I just didn't want to be wrong about anything," I said. "Not even the parts that hurt." The industry press picked up the story within 10 days. The headline in the primary trade journal was careful and neutral. "Brightfield Technologies undergoes executive transition following shareholder realignment." The article mentioned Warren's departure and the incoming board restructuring without specifying cause. But the technology community is not a large one, and the space between official statements and actual knowledge is almost always shorter than legal teams prefer. By the 3rd day, the blind items had started. By the 5th, one outlet had named names. Melissa tried to manage the narrative. A LinkedIn post appeared. "New directions, exciting transitions, the standard vocabulary of professional displacement." The comments were initially warm, the generic encouragement that colleagues extend toward someone they haven't yet decided how to feel about. Then someone with access to the full story decided to share it. I don't know who. I've genuinely never tried to find out, but the details that surfaced were accurate, and the effect on Melissa's professional network was swift and largely irreversible. She called me once, "Nathan." Her voice had a raw quality I hadn't heard from her since the early years. "Please, I need this to stop. I'm being destroyed out there." "I haven't said a word publicly," I told her. "That's the truth. I've given no interview, made no statement, taken no action to amplify anything." "Then how?" "Melissa, think about how many people knew. The board, HR, Warren's own staff, the hotel at the resort. You conducted a secret that involved dozens of witnesses across 2 organizations. Did you genuinely believe that would stay contained?" She was quiet. "This is what accountability looks like," I said. "It's not something I'm doing to you. It's something that happens when the truth becomes known to the people it affects." "I've lost everything," she said. "You've lost the things you were pretending to hold," I replied. "Your position, your reputation, your marriage, those were standing on trust. When you took a sledgehammer to the foundation, this is what the structure looks like on the way down." She ended the call without responding. 2 days later, a recruiter I knew casually sent me a message. "Word's gotten around about what happened at Brightfield. Several firms are asking about your availability. Your reputation in this space is solid. If you're open to conversations, there's no shortage of interest." This was the difference between us. Melissa's professional standing had been constructed from visibility and political capital, from being seen in the right rooms, associated with the right names, credited with the right initiatives. Mine had been built from the slower, less photogenic work of actually doing things well, of delivering on commitments, of being the person in the room who could be trusted with the complicated problems. When the structure shook, hers had nothing beneath it. Mine had footings. A week later, a message arrived from a man named Carter Webb, no relation to Constance, who I'd mentored briefly several years ago, and who was now running a division at a competing firm. "Daniel, I've been following the situation. I want you to know that a lot of people in this industry have a great deal of respect for how you've conducted yourself. Whatever you decide to do next, there's a door open here if you want to have a conversation." I thanked him. I told him I'd be in touch. Opportunities were opening on one side of the ledger while closing on the other, and I hadn't orchestrated any of it. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who think this kind of story requires a villain to be satisfying. I didn't arrange Melissa's professional collapse. I didn't leak anything. What I did was enforce my own rights, document my own reality, and let the truth do what truth does when it's no longer being held in a closed room. Justice, I was beginning to understand, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's just the sound of consequences arriving at the address where they were always headed. The divorce hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in late October. The downtown courtroom had the particular quality of rooms where difficult things are decided. Wood that had absorbed a lot of difficult energy. Fluorescent light that made everyone look equally tired. Melissa arrived with her attorney, a young man named Scott Weaver who had taken the case after 2 other lawyers had reviewed the evidence and declined. He looked like someone doing the best he could with an extremely limited hand. Constance sat beside me with the composure of someone who'd prepared for every contingency and was mildly curious which one the day would produce. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Honorable Diana Forsyth, reviewed the documentation for several minutes before looking up. "Mr. Weaver, I've read your client's petition for modification of the settlement terms. On what grounds are you seeking revision?" Scott stood and smoothed his jacket. "Your Honor, Mrs. Hargrove contends that the proposed division is inequitable given her contributions to the household over 16 years and her reasonable expectation of partnership." Judge Forsyth's expression moved about 2 millimeters in a direction that communicated a great deal without quite constituting an emotion. "Mr. Hargrove maintained the household finances from a trust predating the marriage. He has documented evidence that marital funds were used to support an extramarital relationship." "What specific contributions are you referencing?" Scott hesitated in the way people hesitate when the answer they have isn't the answer the question requires. "Emotional investment, Your Honor. Long-term partnership. The shared creation of a home." "Miss Webb." Constance rose smoothly. "Mr. Hargrove is not seeking anything beyond what the signed prenuptial agreement establishes. Mrs. Hargrove retains her personal savings and her vehicle, and carries no marital debt. Given the documented grounds for this divorce, adultery, professional misconduct, and what our filing characterizes as fraudulent misrepresentation regarding fertility, the terms offered are, if anything, restrained." Judge Forsyth made a notation and looked up. "Mrs. Hargrove, you entered this marriage under false pretenses and conducted an extramarital relationship in direct violation of your marital vows and your employment obligations. Mr. Hargrove has documented grounds for a fault-based proceeding and has chosen terms that reflect more generosity than the evidence requires. I suggest you accept them." Melissa's face had gone the particular pale of someone who has spent months arguing against a current they now understand they never had a chance of outrunning. She leaned toward Scott and said something. He shook his head. "The settlement stands as proposed," Judge Forsyth said, and signed the papers. "This court is adjourned." Outside the courthouse, on the stone steps with the October air moving cold across the plaza, Melissa caught up with me just as Constance had gone ahead to file the final documents. We were alone for the first time in months. I turned. She looked smaller than I'd seen her in years. The suit was expensive but wrong on her somehow. like it had been bought for a version of herself that no longer existed. The composure that had been her most consistent characteristic was simply gone. "Nathan," she said my name the way people say things when they don't have anything beyond the name itself. "I just need to say I'm sorry for all of it. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know it's real." I looked at her for a long time, looking for calculation and finding only exhaustion. "I believe you're sorry," I said, "but I don't think you're sorry for the choices. I think you're sorry for where they ended up. That's a different thing." "That's not fair," she said. I adjusted my coat. "You told me for years that you wanted children. That was a lie you maintained through a medical procedure you had before we ever exchanged vows. You had an affair with your CEO. You watched me believe our marriage was intact while you were constructing its replacement, and now you want to talk about fair." She looked away. When she looked back, her eyes were wet. "I did love you, once. I think I really did." "I believe that too," I said. "And maybe that's the saddest part of all this, that it was real, and you still made every one of those decisions anyway. That the love wasn't enough to make you honest." I adjusted my coat, looked at her one last time. "Goodbye, Melissa. I hope you find out who you are when you're not performing for an audience, but that's not something I can be part of anymore." I walked away. I didn't look back. 14 months later, I stood at the window of a new office. Higher floor, better view, different city from the one where this story started. The consulting firm I'd joined as a senior partner specialized in corporate restructuring, which turned out to be exactly the kind of work I was suited for, going into broken things and helping them become functional again. There was something I appreciated about that symmetry. Brightfield Technologies had been acquired by a larger group for $220 million. My 64% stake had produced a return I still wasn't entirely accustomed to thinking about in realistic terms. I'd set aside a significant portion for a foundation supporting youth development programs, kids growing up in systems that weren't built to catch them. Constance had helped structure it properly. "You're building something real," she'd said at the signing. "That's the clearest sign that you've gotten to the other side of this." Joanna called me on a Tuesday afternoon. She and Melissa had officially stopped speaking. That bridge, Joanna had told me several months earlier, had not survived the full accounting of what Melissa had done and what Joanna had known and how long the silence had lasted. It had been painful for Joanna. I'd told her I understood. "She's working for a small analytics firm now," Joanna told me. "Not her field, not her city. Pays decent, no visibility." She asked about me. "Sometimes," Joanna paused, "I tell her you're well and that you've moved forward." "Which is true, right?" "Mostly," I said. "Some days are easier than others." The truth was layered in a way that resisted clean summary. I didn't miss Melissa, didn't lose sleep over what might have been different, didn't spend time rehearsing the version of events where things had gone another way, but I was more careful now, more deliberate about trust, slower to open the full architecture of myself to another person, not because I'd decided that was the smart approach, but because something in me had recalibrated on its own, the way a joint heals slightly differently after a bad break. My phone lit up with a message from Constance. "Lunch Thursday. There is someone I'd like you to meet. A former colleague, recently navigated something similar to what you went through, exceptionally perceptive and genuinely funny. No agenda, just thought you might have things in common." I looked at the message for a while, then I typed back, "Thursday works, send the details." I looked out at the harbor visible from the window. Ships moving at their own pace, indifferent to observation, just going where they were going because that's what ships do. That's what I was doing, I realized. Not racing toward anything, not running from anything. Just moving forward at a pace I'd chosen, in a direction that felt like mine. The man I'd been the morning Melissa packed that unfamiliar lingerie and kissed my cheek on the way out the door. The man who believed that patience was always rewarded and that the person who shared your home necessarily shared your life. He had not survived this. But what had come through on the other side was something I valued more. A person who saw clearly, who acted with integrity even when no one was watching, who understood the difference between loyalty and passivity, and who had learned at considerable cost that the most meaningful things you build are the ones constructed on a foundation that was true from the beginning. I still wanted those things: partnership, honesty, a life that meant what it appeared to mean. I just learned to be more careful about the materials. My phone lit up again. Constance, she's already confirmed. Looking forward to it, apparently. I smiled, set the phone face up on the desk, which I'd never done in this office before, and for the first time in over a year I let myself think, without immediately arguing myself out of it, that the next thing might be good.